Hi, everyone. I think we will get started. Thank you for joining us. Welcome to today's webinar, Furniture and Impact Reporting, Creating a Roadmap for Change. I'm Mona Chun with Measurable Transforming Furniture. This webinar is produced by Measurable Transforming Furniture, which supports changemakers across the furniture industry in transitioning to a circular and climate-positive future. We'd like to thank our co-sponsors and partners, Lot 21, the Furniture Society, the Good Future Design Alliance, IIDA New York Sustainability Circle, and the New York School of Interior Design, and our promotional partner, Parsons Healthy Materials Lab. All of our links are in the chat. Thanks to our partners. This is the second webinar in our series, Impact Reporting for Change, Building Accountability into the Furniture Industry. This series includes 3 digital action guides, detailed articles walking you through the what, how, and why of impact reporting, understanding your impacts, and opportunities for change, which is soon to be released. This series also includes 2 webinars. Today's webinar covers topics in the second and third action guides, and links are in the chat for action guides 1 and 2, and the recording of the first webinar. Watch your inboxes for the third action guide, which is to be published in the coming weeks. In case you missed it, the first webinar was where we covered what exactly are impacts and impact reports, why they're important, how to get started creating or improving reports, and what should get included. I thought the best recap would be to share some takeaways that attendees submitted in the post-webinar surveys. It was so exciting to hear about companies thinking so comprehensively about their impacts, both negative and positive. My takeaway is that impact reporting doesn't have to be a burden or a risk, which is, I think, the more common perspective. The importance of compiling data so that meaningful progress can be tracked. Create an outline first, collect data you already have, and look into other reports and collect what interests you. That impact reporting, no matter how much you can do, is an important step in moving your company toward more sustainable practices. It's important to start somewhere with what you know. Reporting, it's not a one-size-fits-all. Continuous improvement and measuring are key. Impact reporting is a combo plate: time commitment, transparency for trust, and visual storytelling to accompany data. So we'll be building off of these points today. You can watch the video for this helpful foundational content, but don't worry, you don't need to have attended or watched that webinar to follow along today. So our goals today for the webinar are to explore impact reporting as a tool for turning data into a roadmap for change, provide insights into the process of identifying and prioritizing impacts, and to share concrete opportunities and challenges with setting targets, taking action, and making measurable improvements. Before I go further, I have one invitation and some logistical details. First, the invitation. For all our attendees, thank you for taking the time out of your busy days to join us. It's great to see this diverse group of professionals on the webinar. Please continue introducing yourselves in the chat. And while we hope you'll learn a lot from our guests today, we know you, all of you, are both learners and experts as well. So if you're interested in networking and building community with other like-minded folks on this call, you might include, along with your name and company when you're introducing yourselves in the chat, your email or LinkedIn, or maybe even what you're open to being called up about or need help with. Let's build this network for change because we know we can't do it alone. And on that note, with some logistics, we greatly appreciate your input and questions. And you may see, if you join the first webinar, that we've incorporated your feedback and unanswered questions into today's content and format. We'll also be incorporating some of the many questions you submitted when registering into today's webinar. So feel free to add questions as they arise in the Q&A box, not the chat box where you'll be introducing yourselves. I'll try to get to clarifying questions as we go, but I will save most questions to the last 20 minutes. So please stay on for the full 75 minutes if you're able. So again, questions in the Q&A box, introductions, and any tech questions or messages for our team in the chat. And we will be sharing the video, chat, Q&A logs, and a list of resources and links after the webinar. So I'd like to invite our guests on today and welcome them. Aileen Strickland McGee is the Director of ESG at Steelcase. She weaves together research, strategy, and stakeholder engagement to drive collective action on the company's ambitious people and planet aspirations and commitments. Aileen is passionate about the power of design, cooperation, and systems thinking to create more just, equitable, and regenerative futures. Emily McGarvey, the Director of Sustainability for Room and Board, brings 20 years of experience spearheading social and environmental strategies with a focus on product, supply chain, operations, and branding, leading sustainability initiatives for Room and Board and Room and Board Business Interiors, the brand's commercial arm. She is strategically focused on bringing sustainability to the forefront of furniture manufacturing. And Lucy Crane, Head of Sustainability at Modus, has guided the company to become one of Britain's most progressive furniture manufacturers. She takes a holistic approach to furniture, combining her knowledge of low carbon and circular economics with an understanding of the broader sustainability landscape and the need for a fairer world. Lucy is the author of Neville's 3 action guides that accompany this webinar series. Welcome. I'm excited to be joined by these change makers in the industry to hear how they've tackled the reporting process, their strategies for prioritizing and setting goals, as well as their challenges and successes in creating change. Speaking of change, I would love to start our conversation today with optimism and inspiration, connecting impact reporting to change. So I'd like to start with each of you sharing a little about how the process of tracking and reporting has led to broad change for your companies and one specific and measurable indicator that you'd like to share. Let's start with Emily.
I'm very happy to be here. So Room and Board has been doing impact reports for just the last couple of years, and our first impact report was released in April of 2023. So within that first impact report, we also launched several public-facing goals, and the launch of our first impact report has really led to a couple of things: some really consistent sustainability messaging, which means we're all singing from the same sheet music, and some real acceleration of our efforts. I feel like we had internal buy-in, but once we launched the report, we now had external accountability. So one area that I think is an example of that, and one area where we've seen some great success and acceleration, is our 100% sustainably sourced wood goal. And so when we released our first impact report, we launched the goal and shared that we were at 85%. But over the next year, I think because of that reporting, we worked really closely with our vendor partners, and we knew exactly where we needed to track our progress and have really detailed conversations along the way, so that we were working harder on that external goal, because the accountability, I think, really pushed us forward. And so now we're at 95% and continuing to work on that.
That's fantastic to see, Emily. 95%. Can we move to Lucy? Same question.
Hi. We've also done a couple of reports, though we've been recording data for a lot longer than that. And I think from a broad perspective, one of the key things that it's enabled us to do is to have really good visibility of our carbon emissions. We've been recording our carbon emissions in detail so that we have a really good picture over the last 5 years, and tracking the data and now reporting on that data has enabled us to reduce our scope 1 and 2 emissions by over 50%. But it's always a process of learning, and you learn as you go along. And we've learnt that really the bulk of almost every company's emissions sit in their scope 3 emissions. And for us, that's in the materials that we buy to make our products. So to give you a really specific example of where we've been able to reduce carbon is in our products themselves. And there's 2 ways really that you can reduce the carbon of a product. You either swap out a high carbon material for a low carbon material, which is what we did with the edge-free seating that you can see there. Usually you'd upholster using polyurethane foam and polyester fibre, which are both really high in carbon. So we swapped those for coconut fibre and wool, and using all natural fibres made a significant carbon reduction in that product collection. And another example that I have is of a much more circular approach to design. So if you design a product with a circular approach, then the intention is that it's going to have multiple lives, multiple life cycles, and the upfront carbon of the product in a way will be stretched over time, making it less carbon intensive. So a big part of our strategy is to develop products with removable covers, because if you offer a removable cover, you can refurbish that product, and it can get multiple lives in use. And this one, Maluma, the bar chart there shows the difference between buying a whole new chair at each refurbishment cycle as opposed to just buying a new cover. So by buying a new cover, you're saving over 60% of the embodied carbon. So none of this is possible without tracking the data and having really good visibility of where your carbon emissions are building up.
Thanks, Lucy. And we did talk about carbon footprinting of furniture in webinar last year. So if you'd like to check out more on the carbon footprinting of furniture, you can look in, you can check out our webinar on the topic. And stats like these really help how we're seeing the changes possible. And I wanted to flag one thing in your edge-free slides, that the coconut fiber uses 50% less carbon than the traditional foam. Love that. Can we move to Aileen?
Yeah, sure. Hi, everybody. So I'm going to actually speak a little bit more about the process of putting reporting together and sort of how that has changed. So Steelcase, we've been doing impact reports for a number of years. I mean, they've been called different things over the years, but what's needed and what we see changing is like multiple stakeholders needing to really understand. So before, maybe not as many people were reading it, and now, our customers, our employees, buyers, investors, we see that need is rising. And so we have to really evolve the ways that we were communicating, both in the report and then what we were, how we were presenting our data and the narratives around that. And so over the last 2 years, we've really reinvented our own internal process to leverage our cross-functional ESG data platform and woven that in and really designing the process for the strengths of the different people and teams that make this possible. And so, for example, before it was a little bit more of like a baton passing, right? You'd have like the SMEs, they'd give that to the communications, and then they'd take that. And what we were finding was like there was improvements that could be made in this process that would make this all a lot more cohesive with a lot more buy-in along the way from an internal standpoint. And so we redesigned that process so that instead of sort of a handoff of the data to someone, to a communications person who would take that, we designed it to have like consultative meetings, for example, with the SMEs and the people who are actually creating the narrative of the stories. And so that the storytelling around the data could be really true and representative of what that data was saying about the progress against our goals, and done in a way that would appeal to broader stakeholder groups, while at the same time having the SMEs not have to create and write that, because they're not communications people. They're really like the people doing the work that has the data, that can understand the nuances of it. And so that was really game changing for us internally, to have even just that co-creation, that co-creative period. And it really helped the efficiency and effectiveness in that process. So the edits weren't as much. All of a sudden you had more people across the organization even understanding what we were doing and why, which has bled into beyond our impact report and the ways in which we're telling and communicating our progress around these things throughout the year. And so I think it's, and then of course we've leveraged our ESG platform in really robust ways, which has been a really game changer for us. So my colleague who leads that work has done an excellent job in really thinking about the subject matter experts across the organization as the user and designing the process so it's as easy as possible for us to see it as a system, for people to use it, and for us to create and communicate compelling narratives and reporting around what we're doing and why.
That's great. That's great. It's great to hear how you've been connecting the dots across the whole organization. We'll get a little bit more into that systems approach later. Let's dive into the nuts and bolts now, starting with how we identify and prioritize our impacts. It's critical to prioritize impacts, or the process of improving or creating change can become overwhelming. A company's impacts are sometimes called material topics in reporting, and so you might look at whether this issue is of material significance and worth tracking. So this is a sample, not comprehensive, list for furniture manufacturer that covers environmental, social, and governance issues, these material topics. One common way for a company to identify and sort impacts into a manageable order is to carry out a materiality assessment. And the action guide goes into this in greater detail, but I'll share a quick summary through a sample materiality matrix for a furniture company. So the first step, this is going to be your materiality assessment to really understand your and prioritize your impacts. The first step is to brainstorm and rank your company's impacts or material topics with your internal teams. And these topics of business importance will map to your x-axis on the bottom, low to high. And next, you'll ask your external stakeholders to rank your company's impacts. And that's on the vertical y-axis. And then you'll plot out impacts on your graph based on ranked importance for both groups. And you'll be plotting the environmental, social, and governance topics. This will reveal in your top right corner in green, your priority material topics. So in this example, climate change and carbon emissions ranked highest with both groups, you'll see on the top right, and water use was the lowest. This is just a sample. But let's turn to Aileen and Steelcase's materiality assessment and their processes. So Aileen, a few of our attendees asked about this when they registered. How did you build internal buy-in during the impact identification phase? And what was the process of engaging stakeholders like?
Yeah, again, I think we've had a bit of the benefit of having done these materiality assessments for a number of times. So I would say we had some buy-in, but of course there were still people who weren't there when we did those. So they were new or they didn't quite understand the process from the past. And so I think having conversations with internal stakeholders before we started engaging in this study. So there was really a no one size fits all to the conversation, because it was really about like, who needs to understand this better? Who doesn't understand it? Who do we need buy-in from? And why do we need buy-in from them? And so it was really identifying and kind of personalizing some of those approaches with those individuals or those teams, to have them make sure that they were understanding what we were doing, why this was important, and how this really impacts what we do, or sort of what the results from. And so there was a little bit of copy paste, but a lot of those conversations were just knowing the person or the team and having those to better understand, like, where did we need to hone in on what buy-in we needed from them. And then during the study, it was just making sure that there's a really clear ask, and that the value and perspective of each of the stakeholders that were brought into the study really understood that clearly. And then, of course, we followed up to share the outputs of their contribution. So it wasn't just like, hey, can you contribute? And you never saw it again, or saw it months and months later, but sort of keeping them abreast of sort of what was happening, so they felt like, yeah, that was valuable. And then just the constant reiteration, right, of like why this is important, making those connections. And I think one of the challenges was certainly like bringing cohesion across all of the different people in charge of identifying, setting, and measuring those goals, like who needs to be involved, those impact areas, and do we set goals there? Who needs to be in these? Because a lot of these areas don't just live with one team, but live cross-functionally, right? Circularity is not just the sustainability team; it's our product team, it's our operations, it's a whole host of teams. And so, how do we make sure that we are engaging the different stakeholders who have a lens into that, and making sure that they understand sort of why this is important, and what we're doing. And so, I think that's some of the things that that we were doing to engage those stakeholders.
That's great. It's a lot of co-creation and collaboration, you said, right?
Yes.
Across the whole system. The materiality assessment talks, you mentioned, well, I see on the chart there, sorry, that some of the priority material topics for both your internal and external stakeholders are consumer health and well-being, sustainable product design, circular economy, climate change, and diversity, equity, and inclusion. Was any of this a surprise when you were going through it? And are there things that changed in the way you worked based on these priority topics that were revealed?
Yeah, I would say that nothing was a big surprise, which is probably a good thing. But what we are seeing is like an increase of the importance of these material topics. for multiple stakeholders. So I think that's one thing that, again, it's in connecting those dots around, this is one piece of data, this robust, sort of materiality assessment, but how are we seeing what's coming up there and connecting the dots with some of our other, whether it's primary research that we do as an organization, external. So how can we begin to connect what we're seeing? And it's all pointing in the same direction. And I think, one, we're seeing more of that. So it's not like our materiality assessment just stands alone. It's like, how can we also see that in concert with some of these other research or signals or things that we're seeing? And it's just, again, pointing all in that same direction. And so, for example, how that has changed anything for us is, one, it certainly has made it more visible to a broader swath. So, for example, like our sales team, right? They get a lot of questions from customers about our sustainability aspects, our DEI, things like that. And so as those requests or questions have increased from our customers over the last handful of years, all of a sudden you see our salespeople being then more engaged and interested even in things like this materiality assessment, because they're hearing it from the stakeholders that they are focused on. And so I think what that helped us do is then put a little bit more momentum, action, pressure on some of these material areas to then, whether it's either set goals, take action, or how are we communicating about this more clearly. And so I think the materiality assessment is a nice sort of one stop sort of placemat for that. But then it's seeing how can we dig in on some of these top material issues areas and connect them to other things that we're seeing. And that's where we're seeing some momentum where we hadn't had it before.
That's great. And this is the research that your company did, reflecting what you just said about the key issues on your materiality assessment. Looks like you did some surveys, and the numbers show that across the board, your teams are interested in these areas.
Yeah.
I wanted to highlight something from your impact report, that the fostering inclusion section, because I think it's a great example of identifying a priority material topic like DEI and applying that integrated systems approach you mentioned earlier. I saw in your report that it's woven across all departments, such as through your talent acquisition and business inclusion groups, and across your value chain with attention to diversity in your supplier and dealer communities, and includes commitments to accessible and inclusive design. And I personally loved reading about your Women in Steel initiative. That's cool. So Emily, I would love to turn to your materiality assessment. You mentioned that bringing stakeholders along in the process of creating your assessment was meaningful. And you talked a bit about how you engage stakeholders, built buy-in, and what that meant for your process. So can you explain a little?
Definitely. So our first round of materiality was actually conducted by a third party outside sustainability consultant. We worked with John Haugen at Third Partners, and they were great. And now we're doing our second round of materiality in process right now. But for the first round of materiality, Room and Board was already looking for a more robust sustainability strategy. So we had a lot of internal buy-in that already existed, but the stakeholder engagement was really, really important. And that included an all staff survey. And we also had one-on-one interviews with key internal and external stakeholders. And by bringing those stakeholders along in the process, it created a lot of trust in the materiality assessment results. And that really created a really solid foundation for what was going to be our sustainability strategy.
That's great. Megan just put in the chat Love that you're keeping your teams included in the conversation and showing them the goals. So this seems very key across the board. Emily, this materiality assessment looks slightly different from the sample that we shared, but is the same general idea. The top right are the highest priority issues, what you call tier 1 issues. Was there a material topic that your external stakeholders scored very high that was lower on your radar before? And did it change anything for you?
So I think one thing that surprised us a little bit was that industry influence engagement was kind of an unexpected high ranking, and kind of for internal and external stakeholders. Room and Board has historically been a little bit quieter about our sustainability efforts. And so through this materiality, one thing that we realized is that we are only one company in one industry. And so to really have an impact on the world and society, we really need to be working and involving everybody in the industry and moving everybody towards a more positive impact. And so this material topic of industry influence and engagement ranking high has really changed our communications approach. It really helped lead to our impact report in both 2023 and 2024. And then it's also led me to be joining more panel conversations like this one. And our goal is to really share our story and share our learnings with the hope that more people will join us and that will influence more of the industry.
I love that you highlighted this, because this idea of industry change is what Neville is all about. And one other thing I wanted to note here is that while these material topics are tiered, and we saw in the Steelcase example that the topics are in priority quadrants, each of the issues included in the matrices are of material importance. So you are still actively managing the tier 3 issues, but the materiality assessment is about engaging stakeholders in a meaningful process of prioritization. Again, this is a theme about how you're talking to all internal and external stakeholders. So I wanted to move to the next step. And now that you have prioritized your material topics, you need to understand the scale of your impact. You'll need a baseline to start setting your targets for change. So on this next slide are some of the places you might find that information internally. Your accounting department would have packaging supply orders. The design department would have information on renewable content and products. Sales would have customer feedback and engagement data. Lucy, this question came up from registrants as well about how a smaller company manages all this. Modus is a smaller company. Can you share examples of how you've found and used data?
Yes. I would say that the majority of the information that we collect will be on bills and invoices. So we started with collecting data related to our carbon emissions. So that will be things like electricity use and things like that. So the first place that we started looking was on our bills or invoices. So if we go back to thinking about carbon emissions, they can be split into 3 scopes, 1, 2, and 3. And most people start with scopes 1 and 2, and that's definitely where we started. So when you want to start to build a picture about your carbon emissions, some of the first places that you'd look for scope 1, you'd look on your, if you have them, fuel cards, or you'd start to keep a track of the amount of diesel or petrol you buy for your vans, lorries, for your fleet. So for us, that would be on our fuel cards. And then we would track the kilowatt hours of gas used for our London showroom. And because we have a wood pellet boiler at HQ and the factory, we'd also record the kilowatt hours on the biofuel. So that would give us our scope 1 emissions. And then scope 2 emissions is purchased power. So that would be fairly straightforward. We'd gather together the electricity bills from all our different sites and look at the kilowatt hours on an annual basis, and all of that information would be submitted to we use a carbon accountant external company called Carbon Footprint, who will help us to analyze the carbon emissions each year. And this is what one of the outputs is, that we have a really good visibility of where all those different emissions are building up within our operations. So what this was able to do for us was that we could start to see where the carbon emissions were building up and where we had to focus. So if you look at 2017 to 18 there and look at the slightly darker pink colour, that represents the carbon associated with flights. In 2018-19, you'll see that proportionally a much larger slice of that carbon pie. And then in 2019 to 20, partly by accident more than design, because that coincided with lockdown, so we had a lot less travel, but we could see that we really needed to focus on those emissions associated with our flights. So by 2021, when we were still locked down, we very much transitioned to using video conferencing like everybody else did. So we saw that slice of the pie shrink a lot. But something that was a lot more thought through for us, but again, only made possible by the tracking and the visibility that this kind of data collection gives you. If you look at the grey slice of the pie, the dark grey that's up like near the midnight line, that represents our electricity use, or rather the carbon emissions associated with our electricity use. And in 2017, all the way up to 2019, we were not fully on a renewable tariff on all our sites. So that was the first thing we did. And this information, again, came from our electricity bills. But while we were recording the kilowatt hours each month, we were also recording the spend. And in the UK, electricity is very, very expensive. So it made sense to use that data to build a plan for the installation of solar panels on our roof. And so now we not only have to submit the kilowatt hours from our bills to Carbon Footprint for analysis, we also need to gather information about the energy that we've used from our solar panels. So for that, we would go into our designated portal that tells us how many kilowatt hours we've used, generated, and potentially, if there's more than we need, exported each month. So there are many places that you need to look, and you need to think about it in terms of all the energy that you use. And that is probably the first place to start. Look at your bills, because they will tell you a lot.
Thanks, Lucy, and thanks for those specific examples. For Room and Board, Emily, how have you found the data and information you need to build your impact report?
So what I usually try to start with is a framework, because then you know what data you're trying to gather. And so for us, our framework is better products, better for people, and better for the planet. And it's kind of like your annual yearbook, right? Like you want to be able to share the data that's important, you know, the pictures of all the kids and the names that go along with it. But you also want to have the storytelling of prom and the art club and all the other things as well. And so it's this really unique combination of storytelling and data that's really important. So I like to say we first start with gathering all the data you have. So if you have a press release, if you have monthly reporting you've been doing, if you have internal communications, you may have more information than you realize just by keeping people up to date throughout the year. So definitely start there once you have your framework. And then you fill in the gaps. And some of those gaps can be big, right? It's your annual reporting for greenhouse gas emissions. It's your water data. It's your waste data. And so one specific example of data that we have is our monthly waste diversion tracker. And that allows us to see our annual impact at a monthly level, how we're diverting the amount of operational waste from landfill, which last year was about 11 million pounds of waste diverted. And then we take that information and that data, and we've created this visual that you see here, and we tell the story. Not only do we share the data of the 11 million pounds, we also can share a visual in the impact report, kind of showing our approach of how we're keeping products out of landfill, starting with designing for longevity and then moving all the way down to being towards recycling.
Yeah, that's a great example of how you found the data. You needed to measure impact. Now, I'd love to, if you could walk us through your process of turning all this data into a roadmap for change.
Yeah, absolutely. So what you're seeing right here is our sustainability strategic framework. And this really starts with materiality. And that materiality really informs the strategy. And then coupled with adding in benchmarking of what your peers are doing in the industry and what's already happening in the company, that really creates this strategy. And so for us, as we look at products, people, and planet, we have our prioritized issues underneath. And so the sustainable materials, chemicals management, those 9 priorities come directly from our materiality as we start to prioritize what we're looking for. And so then each of those pillars also have an aspirational commitment. For example, for better products, we talk about that we're committed to more sustainably designing and sourcing products through improved materials and practices. So then we've set SMART goals to really make concrete steps forward on each of the material issues. And you'll see we don't have a SMART goal for all of the 9 priorities. This was our initial round of goals that we set out where we wanted to prioritize and start the work. And so if we start with materiality, which leads into a strategy, and then that framework helps us prioritize the 9 different issues, and then the SMART goals start to say, what are we trying to get to and what are we trying to achieve? And the other thing I would say too is, the other thing that we'll look at a lot is we recently became a B Corp certified. And so we have an impact assessment framework that we can really use to help prioritize what the best in class company looks like. And that also helps us push our efforts.
I really appreciate that you put SMART goals to these commitments. And for those who don't know the framework, a reminder, SMART goals are specific, measurable, achievable, relevant, and time-bound. But Lucy, I know you can talk to us about how hard it can be to set the right goals and targets.
Yes, and I like to think of that A in SMART goals as ambitious rather than achievable, because I think we need to be really ambitious if we're going to limit global heating to 1.5 degrees. So I would say that we do need to be ambitious, but sometimes people like me are a bit too ambitious, and you can set a goal that you are not going to reach. And I think it's really important that when that happens, you put your hand up to it and you say, we didn't get there, and you explain why, and you reevaluate and find a way that you can remain ambitious, but not become deflated from not reaching your goal. So you've got to aim high, and if you fall a bit short, that's okay. You just need to reevaluate how you can get there next time. So I think that's really really key, and this definitely happened to us when we set the target in to be 100% recycled or compostable packaging by 2023. Now, the issue with that very ambitious goal when we set it was that the rest of the world wasn't really ready to, in the contract sector, to manage compostable plastic. It's very easy to manage in the home, but in building sites and so on, you can't contaminate a recycled a plastic stream that's going out for recycling with any compostable plastic. So in the end, we decided we're not quite ready to shift to compostable bio-based plastics. So, you know, that was a really good example of perhaps being a little unrealistic. And then on the other hand, we've smashed our carbon reduction targets for scope 1 and scope 2 every single year since 2018. So we probably need to up our ambitions on that. But I think you need to just keep coming back in, evaluating where you're at, and eventually, you know, you will have ambitious targets that you can work towards and that you can reach. It's a bit of trial and error.
That's thank you. Thank you for sharing that. That's really helpful. We can't always get it right. We still have to move forward and try. I wanted to jump to Aileen. Would you have a specific goal or target that you were able to meet thanks to the increased visibility from the report process, or that you're most proud of?
Well, I think a lot of our goals are further out. So I think back to Lucy's just graph, like as we look forward. So it's at this point more about like making that progress, though I think in making all of this much more visible, and like I said, thinking about those various stakeholder groups. So making the narrative and the reporting more compelling, engaging. I think creating this narrative of the people, the planet, making it simple for people to understand, because we did not have that a couple of years ago. And so it was really difficult for people to even understand what we were doing. And so much like Emily and Lucy have said, like bringing more clarity to that, I think what that has done is helped us not only more people see and understand, but start to see like, where can we make more progress together? I mean, we're a company of like over 11,000 employees, and a lot of these goals touch teams of people. And so by doing this and starting to get down of like, how are we going to tell this story? What are we missing? We're starting to identify more of like where we have some of those gaps to say, oh, okay, this is where we need to get closer together. And what does that mean? And maybe that's on the metric side, maybe that's on like how it's getting done. So I think what the reporting has done is not one goal in particular, but across them really start to see it as a larger ecosystem of advancing and leading and pushing progress across all of our people planet goals. And so that it's not just momentum in one area, but you know, one area might be moving a little bit faster or have more support, and now it's kind of bringing the whole along. And I think that really for us can be really hard as a large organization, but that's also where our power is as a large organization. So it's kind of two sides of the same coin there.
And we're starting to see more of these reports. Lucy, in our prep call, was mentioning that the biggest surprise for her was about how it was not about the process of impact reporting itself, but the pace at which this is becoming a norm. And we have a lot of webinar registrants who are interior designers and architects specifying furniture. And they've asked, you know, they're wary of greenwashing when looking at all these impact reports. And now as more reports are coming out, I wanted to ask you, Emily, would you share one thing our attendees might look for when assessing if a furniture company is truly committed to transformational sustainability goals and practice?
And the impact reports are really about an organization. They're not necessarily about a specific product. There might be stories or goals around specific products or materials that they're working on, but an impact report truly is about an organization. And so you can see here, one thing that I look for is kind of an overview of the sustainability strategy or their highlights of what's happening, and they're really a snapshot of progress. because having in one spot the goals and the progress is for me a really good sign to say, okay, the first image you can see what they're working on and how they're structured. And in the second image, we're really showing that tangible evidence of like, what are our SMART goals? How are we, what's the status of them? What progress have we made? And so for me, seeing that, and obviously this is my own impact report, but being able to see the strategy and then the progress on the goals is showing me that there's like a real commitment to sustainability.
Right. I love this visual representation of the goals and progress. And we asked Aileen and Lucy the same question, and we thought we'd end the slides with some samples from other companies. So Aileen, what would you look for in a furniture company's impact report when assessing how serious they are about change?
Yeah, I mean, I would build on what Emily just said, because I think that's what I would look forward to. But I think also like looking at those aspirations of like, are they really aiming for a future that centers the well-being of people and the planet? And then how are they doing that? And so some companies may take a very focused approach on that and really push in one area. I think for us at Steelcase, we've looked across impact areas and are looking at like, these are our, we've got our 6 under people planet that we're pushing. And so that you can start to see, and that kind of speaks to the strategy that Emily was speaking of, like, how are they doing this and how far are they aiming? And do they really understand, like, are they creating a better future for people and planet with the goals that they set and the actions that they're taking and the progress that they're making?
That's great. And so we pulled out some slides from some companies just highlighting the aspirations. Are they aiming for a future that centers the well-being of people and planet? Some goals and proof points. Look at the goals that they have set and the proof points they're making. Are they making progress through data and examples? Some look at where they're working with others on those goals, their community and their partners, and triangulating trust. I think Aileen had flagged this also. Look at third-party verifications to triangulate trust, certifications, awards, recognition, and you could look at the legacy. It's not always a certain indication of where a company may be going, but gives a grounding into how these deeper values go within a company and its history. And I know, Lucy, like, you're A for ambitious rather than achievable. I think you'd like to see companies going even further. We have Lucy.
Sure.
Items.
I think it's really important. One of the things that you need to look for in an impact report is where somebody is willing to say, we didn't achieve this and this is why. And this is a really good example of a company showing really good progress. In the top bar chart there, they started with 10% of their products having FSC certified timber inputs, and by 2022 it was up at 99%. Great. But what I'm really interested in is the other one, where they've set this 2030 goal of a 10% share of post-consumer scrap steel, but by 2022 they haven't really made any progress and they're still at 2.6%. But they've been transparent about that and they've explained why. And I think that's really important when you're looking at all these fabulous impact reports that come out. Look for total transparency. Look for a warts and all approach. Ask yourself, is this all green? Lots of lovely pictures of trees. We need to look for some concrete evidence. And I think that it's really important that an impact report sits within the wider sustainability landscape and speaks to the bigger picture of planetary boundaries, which you've got 2 really good examples here of are ocean pollution and ocean acidification and climate change? And does the impact report address the issues of social justice and planetary boundaries?
That is great. And it's great to end these slides with looking at some other companies as well and how they've done it. We have lots of great questions coming in and many that were submitted. So we'll move to some of the questions. Megan asks, curious to hear how quickly or how long it took everyone to plan and implement these initiatives. Was there any point in your journey where you felt you needed to just make a decision or compromise to get started? Moving a business ahead to measure these goals is no small feat. So kudos to all on the panel for leading the way. And if you'd like to share.
I'll jump in real quickly. I mean, this probably deserves a longer answer than this. I would say that yes, we have just somewhere we've like jumped in, like there's having the strategy to understand like where we're going and why, but then you don't figure out all of the details first. So there is a bit of this balance between, you know, having that strategy, having that thoughtfulness, where we're making these choices, but then just getting started. And then once you get started, we're learning like, oh, here we hadn't thought about this, or this is coming up, or, you know, this happened in that process. So we have to iterate anyway. And so there is a fine balance between like thinking thoughtful, strategic, and then taking that action and then learning through that process. And so I think back to what Emily and Lucy pointed out of like, you can identify what those areas of impact are, and then where do you want to set those goals? Where are we going to prioritize? And then just getting started. I think like that's enough to get started. And that's how we've taken that approach. And then as we learn things along the way, it's going back and understanding like how do we close some of those gaps that we may have missed or that we hadn't fully thought of as we've been moving forward.
I think the question is about what Aileen just answered. A subset of that, I think, is also the timing and how long does it take for an impact report. So just as an example, I'm starting to collect data in like November and December and figuring out what all information do I have from the year? What's the framework? What are the stories we want to tell? So November, December, I'm kind of pulling that framework together. And then January through March, we are gathering all the data and putting it all together, and then we release it around Earth Day in April. So just as a timeline for the impact report, that's kind of how that works for us.
That's great. There's another question in here that speaks to some of your points about transparency, Lucy. When having buy-in discussions, how have any of you approached individuals who fear sharing progress because they fear being called out for the progress that has not been made, or how things used to be done? Can any of you share a little bit more about engagement and fear?
I don't experience those things. I think that there is a little bit of fear around sharing too much of our plans. So I think in a roadmap where you're setting out what your plans are for the next year, the next 2 years, the next 5 years, and so on, kind of longer term goals, I think there's a bit of fear around being really transparent about what you're doing if it's considered that you have a competitive advantage. So I sometimes have to kind of work to get buy-in in terms of, you know, we have to share this. We have to share this because we can't do this on our own. And I'm a really big fan of working in groups with other manufacturers so that we can all kind of shift to change. So that's where I would say I experience a little bit of, oh, I'm not sure about that. Or at least I used to.
I may have experienced a little bit of hesitancy because Room and Board is a privately held company, and as of April, we're 100% employee owned, which is very exciting. But we just hadn't shared the information before, and so sharing it for the first time, there was a little hesitancy. And I would say sharing other people's reports was really helpful. You know, this is what this company is sharing, this is what that company is sharing, so that we can kind of show that the level of information that we're sharing is in line with what other companies in the industry are doing. And that really helped make people feel more comfortable.
Great example. And in our action guides, for those who want to see more companies' impact reports, we've highlighted quite a few that have fantastic elements to their reports. One question from Dinky: as I'm looking at the different fabulous reports and companies striving to communicate and create a narrative to share their sustainability efforts to diverse stakeholders, what would be the key elements that can make this same report more accessible, engaging, and valuable to the different stakeholders?
So sorry, that was a long question. So until I see it visually,
I think it's about how to make it
question.
accessible to different audiences. This is a lot of information.
It is.
And it's across teams will understand maybe the information differently.
Yeah, and I think this is where internally having the different people or teams involved in creating this and using their strengths was really key to like leveling up our ability to communicate this more broadly to stakeholders. So like I said, like the subject matter experts who are doing this work, they're not communications people. And they understand this stuff more than anybody. And so the way that they're going to communicate about it is going to be different than somebody whose job it is to think about who are our stakeholders, how are we having this message. And so I think when we were able, like I said at the beginning of the webinar, to combine that and really like leverage the strengths of the people co-creating this report together, because it takes, I mean, for us, it's like over 100+ people that are involved in like creating this report. That's when it was like, here's what the data means. Here's what we're actually doing. And then the communications people can like look at that and say, like, how do we make this more compelling? Like, what is the story? Because the people closest to the work aren't always the ones who are able to best understand that that is the story. And so by really working at this as a cross-functional team, that's when we were much better able to do that and to have a really clear direction. And like that narrative structure was really like, here's how we're going to help people understand it and how do we simplify it without losing some of that complexity that we want to communicate, but we have to scaffold that in a way that is approachable to a wide variety of audiences.
Great. I'm going to combine a couple of questions here about designing products. Has gathering data and reporting impacted how you design products? Are you thinking about design for assembly, reducing VOCs, making your products healthier? Is the reporting and gathering the data for that been helpful in how you're designing differently?
I'll come in here if that's okay. I think there's sort of two different sides to impact reporting in terms of the data. You've got your really, really quantitative data. So like, you know, your carbon emissions building up or your waste, you know, hopefully reducing. And then you've got your more qualitative data that needs kind of more storytelling. So your quantitative data will kind of be your pie charts, your bar charts, scatter graphs, and so on. And then your more qualitative data will have more of a narrative around it. So it's difficult to have very kind of punchy graphics and charts to describe something like we've all our collection has got been tested for low VOC emissions, whereas reducing your carbon is really visual. So I think there's kind of a little bit of a divide between two different types of kind of data, and again, social things don't tend to sort of have charts unless it's kind of like male, female, split in management or directorship or so on. So yeah, I would say you've got to kind of match the data to the visual. And just to add to what Aileen was saying, I think graphics are absolutely vital in an impact report. And if that's not your thing, even if you're a really small company, I would say get someone that is their strength, because she's right. We live and breathe this, and we don't always know the best way to make an instant story. And infographics are really, really useful. And I also think it is quite handy to have one page, like Emily showed earlier, one page, kind of all your main points on there, your highlights, one page. And if nobody's going to read anything else, they can at least kind of, there it is, one page. So, yeah.
That's great. I'm going to combine some questions that were sent in earlier. Advice for small businesses, scale of furniture manufacturing, or independent designers, solutions for smaller businesses or solopreneurs, about what to begin with, and how to incorporate impact reporting into their practice. Maybe, but they won't have tens of thousands of employees like Steelcase. But
I think you start with what you have. Like impact reporting can be as rigorous or as non-rigorous as you want it to be. So it may be looking at what types of information have you been sharing internally or externally throughout the year, and how do you bring that together into your main themes or your main accomplishments? And who knows, it could be a glorified newsletter to start with, and then it can grow over time to be including more data like waste or greenhouse gas emissions. But I think being able to share the highlights of the impact, like what have you done for people and planet in the last year, it can be as simple as that. So I would say start with something, and don't worry if you don't have every piece of data that you find in a more robust report.
And how does your company overcome the cost of implementing these sustainability strategies, especially when it comes to getting internal stakeholder buy-in?
I think that you will save money. I think I've saved the company a considerable amount of money in terms of better waste management, energy, and so on. So yes, some things cost, but overall, I think there's huge business benefits that that people just think it's expensive. It's not just expensive, and it also builds in longer term resilience that we can't afford to be too short-termist in our approach. So I think it's a really good investment.
To build on that, I think everything we do has a triple bottom line. So sometimes it's easy to see the environmental or social benefit. But when you're looking at something from a financial perspective, it's either going to drive sales or reduce expense, like Lucy was talking about, or it's going to enhance your brand reputation or mitigate your brand risk. So one of those four levers is going to happen on the financial side, and figuring out how something on the social and environmental piece, like understanding that full triple bottom line, will be helpful as you build those business cases. Because I agree with what Lucy said. It really should be driving your business in a positive way, both financially, socially, and environmentally.
That's great. And we're getting close to the end. So I wanted to end with a final question that was submitted because it also came up on our prep call. And we just mentioned it again today. How can different trades, design, construction, product work together to better drive impact? So maybe more specifically for each of you, what is one thing that you will do or one step you will take and hope others might take towards collective action for industry change? It's a big, quick last question.
Start, and my word would be alignment. There's so many different big challenges in sustainability that need to be addressed, but how can we bring a group of people together that are aligned under one vision? So what do we want to tackle? Is it waste at the end of life? Is it the carbon footprint? Like finding a common vision and then alignment underneath that, and then finding the players that want to be a part of that, and then starting to move forward. But we have to have alignment under a vision.
Aileen?
I would 100% agree with that. And I think too, again, I'm thinking from a Steelcase perspective, I think one of the things is driving that through just taking action, because we are a large company. Like if we can do something and people see that, or when a competitor does something, like follow, right? Or it's like, oh wow, they're doing that. Should we be doing that? And so there's a little bit of like using competition as a driver for collective action in that, which sort of just always ends up happening outside of sustainability as well. But internally, how do you use that for good to say like, hey, they're setting these goals over here. What are we doing? And how do you use that sometimes as the motivation too, to say like let's get more alignment around this internally, and then how do we do that together? And so the fact that like as a furniture industry, if we're all setting and our language is sounding somewhat similar, like that to me is a good thing, right? So like we're all designing for circularity, we're all reducing our carbon footprint, and whether you're a small company or a large company, like understanding the role that you can play in driving that whole forward. And that's going to be a little bit different depending on, again, your organization. But it's heading in the same, like as Emily said, this aligned direction in these certain these areas.
And Lucy?
I think it's about collaboration. And I think it's about having a much greater understanding of passing the baton. So we do need to align, but very often people have a different focus, and that doesn't mean that that you're right and they're wrong, just because you have a different focus, and you need to kind of pull it all in. But we need to be prepared to pass the baton from one person to the next in that chain of architecture and designers and makers and manufacturers, to make sure that we are joining everything up with each step of the whole industry.
Thank you. Alignment, using competition and for good and motivation, collaboration, joining all the parts. That is a great vision for us moving forward. Thank you all. We went over by a minute, but thanks to all the speakers, Aileen, Emily, Lucy, for sharing your expertise and insightfulness and inspiration. Our co-sponsors for being fantastic peers in this journey, and our team behind the scenes, Giovanna, Sim, and Michael, for your seamless support. We will send the video and the resource list in the chat and Q&A at the end. You'll be getting that in the next few days. Please help us by filling out the survey that pops up when you leave. As you saw, we really take the feedback seriously. And I'm loving all of the chat activity. You'll get a log of that. Thank you all for being part of this and engaging, and we will be in touch. Have a great day.
Thank you.